really they are the ones that deserve all of the credit or the blame for what has happened in this presentation today. And I'm kidding about the blame. I think that they've done a fantastic job, and my impression is that there's some really useful information for you to work with.
I'm sure.
From this. I hope that is the case. Okay, so we are now live and recording, and I will turn it over to Angela and to Luke.
Okay, so I'm going to begin screen sharing at this moment. Okay.
All set? Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Donner. I'm a junior here at Niagara University, and I am a political science and international studies major. And right now, I will be turning it over to my colleague, Angela, who will be introducing our presentation for you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Angela Beret. I am a senior international studies major here at Niagara University. Before we get started, there are just a couple things I want to mention. The first is that Luke and I are not currently speaking. However, we are engaging so we will there can be a delay when we disappear as we're trying to. Additionally, we want to mention that there is a little bit of inclement weather this morning, and we have experienced some connectivity issues when we were troubleshooting. So just be aware that we may have some trouble, hopefully not, and we will do our best to push through if that should happen. So this presentation on the effects of COVID-19 and on global homelessness was a collaboration of our International Organizations and Cooperation course led by Dr. David Riley. And we will have time at the end of the presentations to answer questions or further discuss information. And now I am going to turn it over to Luke to get us started.
So we have divided our presentation into 6 sections. In the introduction, we introduce our research questions and why our research is important. In the second, we talk about what SDGs homelessness focused on before the pandemic. In section 3, we talk about the preconditions for homelessness before the pandemic. Next, we talk about how COVID is going to change these preconditions. In the 5th section, we talk about how COVID has modified the SDGs. And in the 6th section, we give the short and long-term impacts of COVID on homelessness and some recommendations we might have for the UN. So first, our research was based around 2 questions that we wanted to answer. First, we wanted to know what are the preconditions for global homelessness? And second, we wanted to know how the pandemic would affect these preconditions. And to analyze this, we used pattern recognition and trends because much of the data was very new or unavailable. And in order to better understand homelessness, we needed to be able to conceptualize the definition of homelessness. So what we decided to use was the agreed upon definition given by the UN of living in severely inadequate housing due to a lack of access to minimal acceptable housing. And as we will elaborate on later in this presentation, we believe that the UN should adopt the inclusive UN habitat definition, but we will talk about that later. So we had a few different focuses of the research. So on the narrow side, we determined that the pandemic will continue to exacerbate already existing flaws that lead to homelessness, both that are on account for by the state or through other means. And on the broad, our focus is that homelessness has the potential to eventually become a global catastrophe. And since the SDGs are intended to build resilience against things like homelessness, we need to acknowledge that COVID will it will undermine the UN's ability to effectively implement this agenda. And finally, we need to recognize that COVID-19 will not be an isolated incident, and we need to be ready and prepared to mitigate future pandemics. So we have 3 base competing arguments that we will be examining throughout this presentation. The first one is that COVID-19 will continue to increase the homeless rate as well as exacerbate systematic failures both within and across states that will help contribute to the increase in homelessness. Second, we can say that COVID-19 will allow us to learn from this experience and prepare for future pandemics. And the best way to be able to do that is that we need to recognize the emerging trends that we see now, and we need to recognize the data that we see now and figure out how we can use this to better determine the future impact of pandemics on homelessness. And our final argument is that there is a possibility that COVID-19 will actually not have a meaningful impact on the spread of homelessness. And this argument comes from the basis that many homeless people are not moving around in terms of migration far distances, and instead they tend to stay within the places that they already remain. So instead of seeing a large outward spread, we will just see an increase in certain places. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Angela, where she will be talking about homelessness and the SDGs before COVID.
Okay, so we identified the specific SDGs that could be used to measure homelessness as far as the data that's available. And the UN Habitat also offers specific suggestions for which indicators would be most useful in measuring the preconditions for homelessness. So the SDGs overall are SDG 1, 8, 10, and 11, with the specific indicators listed. And it's important to note here that the data that would be used within these indicators to track potential trends in order for that to be effective would have to be universalized. So we're going to discuss briefly the preconditions for homelessness as they were before the pandemic within each region of the world. So we identified 8 major preconditions, with 1 through 4 being natural disasters, gender inequality, migration, and affordable housing. And I do just want to mention here that affordable housing does not have a universally accepted definition of what is affordable housing. We did notice several sources used the United States' definition, which is affordable housing is housing where housing costs do not exceed 30% of a nation's median household income. So we use that across the board respective to each nation.
So for preconditions 5 through 8, we have determined that population density, overall poverty, economic shocks, and government interventions are some of the major preconditions for homelessness. I want to note that for population density, we use a very subjective analysis, and we do not have a marker of what is considered too densely populated. So for each of our analysis, it is subjective as to, based on the research we found, whether or not we have determined that it should be considered densely populated. And I also want to draw your attention towards government intervention. As you will see, we do have 2 definitions, which each coincide with the charts that we have made. So definition A will coincide with the first chart, which you will see briefly in a moment, and that is the government does not have adequate policies to mitigate homelessness. And definition B will go with our second chart, which is the government does not provide appropriate measures in the wake of the pandemic. So in order to better understand these preconditions and do our research on them, we decided to break the world down into different regions. We broke the world into 11 regions, as you will see here, which are North America, Central America and the Caribbean, South America, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Northern and Sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Africa, the Middle East, South and East Asia, the Pacific Islands, and Australia. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Angela, and she will talk about some of the research we did.
So the chart that you're seeing right now is the baseline for the preconditions that we established before COVID. And what you'll see are the regional breakdowns that Luke just explained, and then the 8 major preconditions that we identified. I want to note first here that government intervention, again, is using definition A. And as far as the Y and N's that you're seeing, that's a yes or a no, either that precondition is a factor in this region before COVID, or that it was not, which would be an N. So an N would indicate that that was not relevant for that region. A Y would indicate that it was. So we're going to further explain. Before COVID, we identified 3 major preconditions across the globe, which were migration, natural disasters, and inadequate government intervention. And we did identify some of the most vulnerable regions of the world, as you can see, and we will also discuss those more later. So now we're going to look at how COVID has affected homelessness globally. So this is what might look similar to the chart before, but this is the preconditions in the regions after the pandemic. So again, an N would indicate that that precondition is not a relevant factor in the region. A Y would indicate that it is. And for this chart, we are using government intervention definition B. So some trends that we identified, first and foremost, are that we did see obviously a change in which preconditions were the most prevalent, and we saw a change in some of the most vulnerable regions of the world. One thing I want to mention briefly is that for the purpose of those charts, the Pacific Islands was a very subjective region to consider, as the data availability was very sporadic throughout the region. So that's just something to consider. Additionally, any box that you see that has more than one factor or more than one region simply means that those were weighted equally in either their vulnerability or their prevalence. So looking at what happened and what changed as a result of the pandemic, we saw Eastern Europe become one of the most vulnerable regions where it was not previously. And we saw South America and South Africa actually decrease in the weighted vulnerability. However, each region is still vulnerable in their own way. However, COVID has changed the vulnerability status globally. As far as the preconditions, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that economic shocks have been felt globally across the board. And that we saw high population density become a much more important precondition during the pandemic for several reasons. The first being, in highly populated areas, there's a difficulty of social distancing and a lack of available PPE. And additionally, in densely populated areas, we included refugee camps, cities, slums, etc. We saw an exacerbation of other effects of the pandemic. So I do want to mention briefly that we gave a brief overview of each region as to what the most relevant observations were in the wake of the pandemic and homelessness. However, in the interest of time, we are not going to discuss these slides in depth. However, if you have questions, please feel free to ask them at the end. So now Luke is going to explain how COVID has affected the SDGs.
So I'm sure as you're well aware that COVID has definitely changed how the UN is going to have to go about the SDGs for the future of mitigating homelessness. So for the first one, SDG number 3, which focuses on good health, we need to recognize that fighting a pandemic successfully requires that everyone receives adequate health care, no matter of the preconditions. We also need to acknowledge in SDG number 8, which focuses on economic growth, that single export nations need to diversify their economies, especially the ones that rely heavily on oil and natural resources, and also recognize that this is not limited to only to resource exporting countries. The countries that focus heavily on tourism for a large portion of their GDP need to look into diversifying their economies. SDG number 10, which focuses on reducing inequalities, recognize that minority groups have been and will continue to be disproportionately affected, and we will talk about that more in the next slides. SDG number 11 recognizes the need for cities to have available multifunctional housing for people who have been displaced due to disasters, but also we need to recognize the need to have readily available housing for future pandemics. And for SDGs 9 and 11, we need, for building of future infrastructures in cities, we need to think about pandemics as we design our cities. So in terms of when you're designing a building, thinking about having multiple entrances, expanding the size of the hallways to better allow for social distancing, having escalators instead of elevators so you can socially distance while still being able to move large amounts of people, and things like that, like automatic doors. So now we're going to talk about the short-term and the long-term impacts of COVID on homelessness and some recommendations we have for the UN, along with some successful strategies that we've seen that have worked for mitigating homelessness. So in the short term, with no surprise, we expect that winter will continue to exacerbate the already weak programs put in place. And we see this as a problem because shelters need to be able to house people, but they also need to be able to properly social distance people to limit the spread. And since many places will be hitting capacity in the weeks and months to come, we recognize that governments need to start looking elsewhere for temporary housing conditions in the short term. And one of the things that we suggest is, since the tourism industry has been hit so hard due to COVID, that many hotels are sitting there vacant, and that those could be used to as temporary housing just to get through the next few months, and also looking at universities around the world, as many of them have moved online, many of their dorms remain unused. And we also expect an increase in COVID cases in refugee camps, primarily those in Southern Europe, the Africa region, and the Middle East. And once again, we see that high population density will play a major role in the number of COVID cases, just due to how tightly packed together people are and due to the lack of social distancing and personal protective equipment that is provided. Next, we need to recognize that out of all the groups, that minority groups will become disproportionately affected, and that these minority groups include women, people of color, LGBT youth, domestic violence victims, young adults coming out of foster care, and also people leaving prisons or long-term care facilities. And also in the short term, we're expecting that eviction rates will go up. In many places, there are currently bans on evictions, but as these bans be lifted, we are expecting that landlords will begin to kick out tenants in the interest of regaining some of their income. So that is another problem that we see in the short term. In terms of the long term, one of the things that we decided is that in the long term that we need to focus on how homelessness will be heavily exacerbated in the North Africa, Southern Europe region, and the Middle East, and especially those regions like Southern Italy and parts of Greece that are essential crossings for many migrants coming into the EU. And the reason we say this is because we have seen that many EU countries, especially Italy, are shutting down their borders and reducing migration. And actually, for the first time in history, Italy has closed its migration ports. And the reason it has done this is not because it necessarily fears an outbreak of COVID, but because Italy recognizes that it can use the pandemic as an excuse to increase border security in the long run. And we're seeing this trend throughout the world of many states not only using COVID to push border security, but just to push political agendas, just to push political agendas. Another long-term impact is that we expect these evictions to lead to a continuous cycle of poverty. So for many of the people facing evictions, they have already been hit hard by the economic shocks of possibly losing their jobs and are on many different welfare systems. So as people will be evicted, they will have to start over trying to find a new house, which will ultimately affect their job, because if they do not have stable housing, it is more difficult to have a stable job. And we see that leading to a cycle of poverty in which it will be very, very hard for many to come out of. And lastly, we acknowledge that nations who heavily rely on tourism as a main source of revenue will be extremely disproportionately affected. And it is estimated that almost 200 million jobs are at risk due to travel-related bans and restrictions, and that we expect by the end of the year that tourism will fall between 60 and 80%, and that is an estimate given by the World Bank. And I'm going to turn it over to Angela, where she is going to give two of the conclusions that we have cited.
So if I can mention some of the arguments that we addressed at the beginning of the presentation, after we have completed our trend analysis and identified certain patterns, it is our conclusion that argument 3 was not necessarily valid, that we are seeing an increase in homelessness and an exacerbation of systemic failures both within and across states. And the second argument that COVID does allow the potential to better mitigate homelessness in the future only if we analyze the impacts and develop effective mitigation strategies based on the systematic research that is required, so that we can better prepare for and respond to future pandemics. And I do want to say that we discuss future pandemics because multiple sources, multiple research entities suggest that COVID and the coronavirus is not the first global pandemic that we will see in the future, so we need to be prepared for potential pandemics as well. All right, and back to Luke.
So although the focus of our research was not on solving homelessness, we did identify some strategies that have seemed to be working in different regions of the world. So first, we see that in the short term, governments have been repurposing unused buildings, and recognize that this is not limited to just COVID. As we see during things like natural disasters, this often happens, but in areas of South Africa right now, we're seeing that governments are using empty stadiums, and they are actually doing things like blocking off streets to allow people to live out there. In terms of long-term solutions, Finland is the first country in the world that has adopted a housing first initiative. And one of the things that makes this initiative so successful is that housing is viewed as a human right, and that it is guaranteed to all, no matter the precondition. So no matter if you have mental health conditions, if you are an addict, a user, whatever it is, the condition is that you get a house, and then you focus on solving your issues. And another major factor that has helped Finland is that there is a political consensus that homelessness is a wicked problem, and it does require the participation of all and cooperation of all to solve. And many in Finland point that giving everyone a house is completely unfeasible, that is an unfair way to use taxpayer dollars. But what Finland has actually discovered is that on average, housing a person saves approximately 15,000 euros per person every single year. And the last solution that we see is, once again, one that is not unique to COVID, which is offering humanitarian aid and promoting political dialogue. And this is especially important in regions like South America, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, where many institutions are inherently weak and do not have, proper in the right way to adequately attack some of these wicked problems. So we call upon NGOs and things like that, and some of the leading states to offer aid without condition. And finally, we have some recommendations for the UN as things we see to consider when continuing your research on homelessness.
So over the course of this research, one of the biggest issue areas that we found is that there is no universal framework on how states should gather data on homelessness. In addition to that, the available data is varied in terms of the most recent data available, and the lack of a universal conceptualization of what data to gather is also a problem. So identifying a universal framework on how states themselves should gather data on homelessness would be incredibly effective. Additionally, the UN Habitat Inclusive definition of homelessness, we pose that that is a better definition to use when addressing homelessness in the future. Something else important to mention is that immediate action solutions are most useful in disaster situations as in response to immediate crises. However, in the long term, the same things that you might see immediately after a disaster are not going to be as effective. So with that, focusing on primary prevention strategies to combat homelessness in the long run would be more effective. And what we mean by that is primary prevention strategies as the strategies that work to mitigate the social and systematic issues underlying homelessness, as opposed to the after effects of homelessness.
So one of the factors that we have determined that would help to mitigate homelessness coming from the average person would actually be a better understanding of what homelessness is. And we see that that can be done through the media, showing the effects of homelessness, so then people get the emotional side of it. But we also need to educate people to get rid of the stigmas of homelessness, that these people are drug users, that they don't care, and we need to better understand what actually leads to homelessness. And finally, there needs to be broad political consensus that homelessness is a problem, and we need to be able to acknowledge it as a problem and acknowledge that it does require the participation of many governments and a large proportion of people within a nation to help solve. Next, we can see that COVID does provide us with opportunities to revise existing social welfare programs, because for many of the homeless, a post-COVID world is not normal, because for the homeless before COVID, their normal was being homeless. And we need to acknowledge that a post-COVID world means a better situation in which we have better social welfare programs that may provide housing, they may provide more stimulus, it may provide temporary shelter, but shelter nonetheless. And next, we need a universal definition for what is considered affordable housing. As we have used the 30% of a median's of a nation's median household income as our definition, we suggest that there is some type of a universally agreed upon definition that states can work off, and NGOs as well, to figure out what actually is affordable, what is feasible. And finally, the possibility of considering housing a human right. Just as it is thought of in like the Nordic countries, they have been very successful in eradicating homelessness because they consider housing a human right. And it is suggested that other states follow in that precedent. And doing so would break many of the stigmas around homelessness and would also allow for states to have better responses in fixing homelessness.
So that concludes the narrative point of our presentation. We will have time for questions, but before that, I want to turn it over to Adam Kudrowski to briefly talk about the executive summary that he is spearheading in conjunction with this presentation.
So yeah, in conjunction with this presentation, an executive summary is forthcoming, and it will outline the trends highlighted in today's presentation and point to all of the sources of where we drew our conclusions.
Okay. If you have any questions, we would be more than happy to discuss them at this point.
This is unbelievable. You guys did such a fantastic job. I don't know if Dave told you that I'm very new at the UN. I only started July 1. It's can you hear me, everyone?
Yep.
Yeah. It's an incredibly complex organization, and as I'm trying to find my way, I don't, there's nothing that I would question about you. I'm not able to question the research you come up with. This is, I don't know how to begin to thank you. This is a beautiful presentation. I mean, in terms of attractive slides, great arguments, wonderful information. The competing arguments I found very interesting. That I think we're gonna, when I get back to our group here, the Vincentian family representatives, I think we're gonna have a lot of discussion about that. I'm also astounded that you were able to do it globally. I thought the time frame would not allow you to go beyond the United States. So this is even more than we anticipated from you guys, and I'm so grateful. The preconditions for homelessness is very interesting. The short and long-term effects. The recommendations for the UN are absolutely spot on. I never thought you'd have time to come up with an executive summary, but I look forward to that. Dave, before I forget, how long was it? How long was the whole presentation? Do you have a
Just under a half hour. I'd say it
Okay.
was about maybe 25 minutes.
Okay. You know, it was also very interesting. I'm so glad that the students included the whole gender equality issue, because just the other day we were talking in our group. Apparently, there's a disproportionate representation of the LGBT community among the homeless. Among homeless youth, fully 1/3 identify as LGBT, and they're so often overlooked. So I'm so glad there was a mention of that community in there. We're actually looking for a way to raise up that concern in the UN deliberations. Let me see what else here I have. I can think of about 15 people I'm gonna share this with, including the Vincentian Family Homeless Alliance, which I'm sure you're aware of, which was able at the UN to do something historic. I don't know if you're able to tell your students about this one, Dave, but there's a resolution that has passed 2 of the 3 essential steps in the UN process, which of course is very complicated. It's the first time in the 75-year history of the UN, that homelessness is being considered as a standalone issue and not something just bundled up in, all the aspects of poverty. So this is really historic, and the Vincentian family was the lead organization on getting that done. So it's gonna be up for a 3rd committee review. The statement's being drafted now, and if that goes through, it obligates the UN to speak about and do something about homelessness, again, as a standalone issue in the future. So this whole thing and this contribution of the students today that I'm seeing is going to be a tremendous help for that, because instead of the narrow focus on the US, which alone would have been great for us, this global focus is incredibly helpful as we move this forward. And I will keep you informed step by step as we go forward. Now, there's an activity that the working group to end homelessness at the UN, which includes all of the Vincentians, there's a side event, I think I told you about this, Dave, on the 21st
Yes.
at 1 o'clock. And I will, did I send you the link for that?
I thought you had sent me a link for the 27th, but maybe
27th, correct. Did I say 21st? That's today.
Yeah.
The 27th from 1, I think, to 3 or 1 to 2:30.
Yes.
You have that
And
link?
I have not forwarded that to the students yet, but I will. I had
Okay.
shown them the language, but not the update of when the actual date and time is.
Right.
So.
So what's going to happen now in the future is soon I'm going to share this today with the Vincentian family, the other 4 members that represent the family at the UN. Ours is the group that's preparing this side event on the 27th. So I'm going to get this into their hands right away. I'm going to share it with the FHA, the worldwide global effort on to end homelessness. Of course, our intern from St. John's, who's now developing a flyer for the event on the 27th. So there's lots of people that are going to see this, and I'm incredibly grateful. Again, I don't know enough myself yet to even question any of this research. But so much of it resonates with me in a positive way because of some of the research I've already seen. So the students will have to forgive me for not being an expert enough on this issue to actually question any of it. I'd have no reason to. I just have to tell you, it's a beautiful presentation in terms of the visibility of it, the presentation, but the research seems to me to be very solid. And I think you'll hear back, I think, from especially Sister Margaret O'Dwyer, who's the daughter of charity NGO representative at the UN and co-chairs with Jean Quinn from Unanima. They're the co-chairs of the working group to end homelessness. So I'm sure you're going to hear back from them once I get to share this.
Wonderful.
So again, I think you went far and beyond. You have some great students.
That is true, and they deserve all the credit. Just as one caveat, in terms of the research approach that we took, our focus obviously was on breadth rather than depth. And so what I would suggest is that our thought of what would be most useful given the limited time that we had to work with was really to focus in on trends, on sort of the broad patterns, not getting into the depth of the individual stories. Certainly that's something that could be done to validate and reinforce some of our findings, and also to sort of lend the story to what's actually happening to a greater degree. That's something that takes more time, certainly, and more data to be able to really dig deeper into what's happening there. But
Right.
hopefully this gives sort of a broad sketch of patterns, of the kinds of preliminary conclusions that we could reach that might be helpful, if for no other reason than for the process of dialoguing and thinking about what sorts of considerations to take into the meetings that you're heading into next.
I think also one piece of the research I think was very complete was the causes of homelessness through the perspective of the pandemic. I thought that was very complete. I mean, I can't think of anything to add to that.
Great.
So.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, certainly after you've had a chance to look through, we'll send you all of the documentation. Please come back with any questions or any thoughts or any follow-up that you'd like us to conduct, or where you could see us going next. I can say from my perspective as a professor, the opportunity to engage in this kind of work is so much more meaningful than doing classroom exercises. And I can give you one example. In the last class, one of the really exciting moments for me observing the students was a debate about should housing be a human right, and it wasn't an idle question. It was a question that really got to some central issues in thinking about this, that unless the students were invested in their research and engaged in this process, it would be a superficial kind of discussion, but they were really able to think about it in a more meaningful way.
Right.
So for us, this has been not just an exercise, but really an opportunity to think more deeply about these issues.
Right. The students' argument too, that there ought to be one universally accepted definition of homelessness. That's a great point, because we do struggle with that. The FHA effort that we're involved in it's very inclusive definition. It means migrants and refugees, those that sleep roughly on the streets, and inadequate housing, slums. So it tries to involve all three focuses, but that's not the case in every discussion of homelessness. It's a problem. So somehow to come up with a universal definition to work from is a really essential piece of this. So, and they caught that. Students caught that. Yeah.
It occurs to me now, we probably should have invited Lucas Veninger to be a part of this discussion as well. He had sat in on our class at one point and gave us some insights on the work that he had done, both with the Congregation of the Mission, but also what he's doing now with Habitat. And his inspiration, I think, really has helped the students as well to think about the bigger picture of what they're contributing to. So,
Dave, I'm sporadically in touch with Lucas. You want me to include him in the mailing? I have his
I
email.
think that would be wonderful, and I can also, I'll forward him the link as well.
Perfect.
Yeah, but absolutely, yeah, and I think he would appreciate the opportunity to know more about what the Congregation of the Mission is doing moving forward on these initiatives. So
Right.
yeah.
And the students should know Lucas has the reputation now. He's the all-star former intern. You know, he set such a high standard.
Yeah,
He was good.
great, good. Any other input from the students? Anyone else want to
Oh,
jump
good.
in? Anything else to add?
I have one final comment, that Luke and I actually unfortunately didn't even stumble across this source until last night when we were putting the final presentations on, or the final touches on this presentation. But we did find a comprehensive list from the IMF about what specific government interventions are being done globally. So that was a more comprehensive view that would probably be helpful to include a link to with the presentation.
IMF.
Hmm.
Okay. Good. I think, Dave,
Yes.
I think if some of the other members of the group that have more experience with this, especially those that were involved in the writing of the resolution, they would probably have, if they were able to join us today, immediate questions. You know, it'd be much more interesting to have some of them on. But again, because of ECOSOC, they couldn't do it. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Everything these days is so overlapping. I mean,
Yeah.
I sign up for a Zoom meeting, which looks interesting, and then 3 days later, I get another invitation, something I have to be on, and it's a half hour later than the first one. They overlap, and I can't do it all. So unfortunately, timing is everything.
Yeah. We can be available in the future if any of the others do want to engage in a discussion of this, or if they'd like a recap of the presentation or anything like that. We'd be happy to make class time to make that work, or figure out another time that would work for others.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, thank you.
Great.
This has been an unbelievable. I hope this partnership continues because it's been just a wonderful experience so far, Dave. I have
Great.
to tell you. Yeah.
Great, from our end as well. So
Wow.
thank you for the opportunity to work on this. We really enjoyed it.
All right, we'll get back
Okay.
to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so
Have a
much,
great
Jim.
day, guys.
Okay, take care.